Once I was looking for a therapist and I Googled a woman whose office was nearby and who was covered by my insurance. I thought I'd do a bit of research and see what else I could learn about her, any website or reviews, articles. And I found her personal Twitter account, which consisted exclusively of tweets to Jimmy Fallon, a one-sided and plaintive conversation with America's third favorite late-night host. All this is to say, sometimes therapists need therapists. Our next guest has written a new book about just that. Laurie Gottlieb authors the Dear Therapist column for The Atlantic and has a private practice in LA. And her book, Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, is out this week. Here's our conversation with her. Thank you so much for joining us today, Laurie. You have a new book out, and it starts when you yourself go to therapy. You're a therapist, but you decide to go into therapy because you are going through a breakup and you want to talk it through with someone. Tell us a little bit about what ended you up in Wendell's therapist chair.
Right. So I was experiencing what I would call a crisis, which was that a very unexpected breakup happened with somebody that I thought I was going to marry. And, I thought I would go to see a therapist for what I would call crisis management, which is, a few sessions to kind of get through the shock of it all, and then move on. And what ended up happening was, the breakup became a very small part of our therapy, and it ended up being, an exploration of something much deeper.
One of the charming things about the book, and indeed sort of its structure, is that you yourself as a patient make some of the same mistakes that you see therapists making as they come into your office. So you talk about patients who email you and they're like, I just need to come in for, 6 sessions so I can decide whether or not to marry this woman before Valentine's Day. And about how you as a therapist sometimes decline to work with that type of mindset. How did your therapist react when you said, I just need to come in for crisis management? This is just an incident that I need to get through and then I'm going to be fine.
Well, maybe because I'm a therapist, he moved pretty quickly in that first session. But of course, I thought he was smoking something because he said, you're not just grieving the breakup. I think you're grieving something bigger. And of course, my reaction was, seriously, I'm coming in here to talk about this, and this is your professional advice, which is funny because, of course, as a therapist, I know better.
How long do you think that you should give a new therapist if you aren't connecting in that way? You mentioned this first session, you questioned him a little bit and how much he was pushing you.
Mm-hmm.
How many sessions do you think that somebody should stick with it in order to decide if they gel with their therapist?
That's such a great question because the research shows that the most important factor in the success of your therapy isn't the therapist's training or their experience or what modality they use. All of those are important, of course, but it's the relationship you have with the therapist. And so a first session is like a consultation, and you want to see at the end of that session, did I feel understood? And if you didn't, that's something to think about. But hopefully, just as a basis for going back, did you feel understood?
I want to talk a little bit about how you find this person who you think is going to understand you, because this is something that my friends and I talk about a lot, about how tricky it can be to find a therapist. And on the one hand, I know that I, in the past, have sought out a therapist who is Asian because I felt like they could understand some of the cultural nuances that I was going through with my family. Or I have friends who only want to see an LGBT therapist or somebody who is gender nonconforming. But then on the flip side, I always wonder, is it something, are there certain deeper experiences, human experiences, that anyone should be able to address regardless of how they identify personally?
You don't have to go to a therapist who has the exact same, cultural background or sexual orientation. It can be helpful, but I would say you really just want to go to somebody who's going to get you.
Right. And so you talk about this desire for validation that a lot of people come into therapy with. I feel like the flip side is that we all know somebody who are like, oh, that person should be in therapy. So that a therapist can speak hard truths to them or say things that maybe we as a friend can't. But that also isn't quite a therapist's role either to I don't know, really to give it to someone straight. What do you see? How do you walk that balance between validating someone and really giving them the cold, hard truth that they need to hear?
Yeah. So validating is different from agreeing with them. So I can help understand your low opinion of your partner, but I don't have to agree with it. And I think what we do is we hold up a mirror to people. So we're holding up the mirror to help them see a clear reflection of themselves so they can see their blind spots and they can see the ways that they're shooting themselves in the foot but keep ending up in the same place over and over. And we do that with compassion, but it's a compassionate truth bomb. It's very much, your friends aren't going to tell you this, but you need to see, here's something you're doing in the room with me, and I just want to point that out because you might also be doing it in the outside world.
You talk about compassion in particular with one of your own clients, who is a challenging individual when he enters therapy, and you sort of repeat this mantra yourself: have compassion, have compassion. What can we take away from that if we are interacting with difficult people in our own lives? If we're not therapists, maybe coworkers or friends or whatnot.
Yeah. So I think that you have to understand that people are acting in an abrasive way or a difficult way because they're protecting themselves. That's the way that they cope. And yes, it's sometimes it's hard not to take it personally when they're interacting with you, but you have to remember that really it's not so much about you, and that there's something vulnerable beneath it that you would probably really like about this person if they ever let you see the truth of who they were.
This person in particular also has an unhealthy relationship with his phone. He keeps on checking his phone in therapy, and at a certain point you have to ask him to make this a phone-free space. And you also talk a little bit about how you see, especially with young people, smartphones being detrimental. Can you talk a little bit about how you think that phones are impacting our society?
Yeah, I think that phones make it hard for us to sit in silence or to hear our own thoughts. So I think what happens is that, any time there's a moment of a break between something in an elevator, on a line, people whip out their phones, and even the relationships that people have. So a lot of the younger people who come to me, they'll say, and then he said, and then she said, with their thumbs. And I'll say, you had that conversation on text? These are really important conversations, but they don't know how to have them face to face. And then one of my clients said, yeah, well, we used emojis. And she wasn't kidding.
Right.
That's very different from looking in someone's eyes and hearing someone else breathe in the same space as you and picking up on the nuances of body language.
And so what do you think then about therapy apps or therapy that happens completely through the phone? I think there's an ad for them on the subway right now that's like, therapy on demand when you need it in 5-minute increments.
Yeah. Well, even with Skype, where you can see someone, and in certain situations I'll do Skype sessions, but, a colleague said that doing Skype is like doing therapy with a condom on. Even though you can see the person, you don't feel the same energy that you feel in the room with someone. And I think the same is true with, more so with apps and all of the different ways that we use technology to conduct therapy sessions. I don't do that. I will do telephone, I will do Skype, but it's very different from being in the room with someone.
Mm-hmm. The structure of this book is such that we are with you as you go through your own personal therapy, and then as you are a therapist to maybe 4 or 5 different clients who are dealing with a variety of issues. And so we get to see you both helping these people change their lives as your life is being changed simultaneously. And we see your humanity as well. And I'm curious about, for those of us who have been in therapy, it's always tricky about how much of a human you want to see your therapist as, to know that they themselves are fallible. And, when they choose to share personal information, it's always a little bit of like a dance of like, oh, this makes me feel close to you, but do I actually want to see you as a full human? What advice do you have to people about what brain space to hold their therapist in?
Yeah, I mean, the therapy session is very much about the client. We will use self-disclosure very intentionally, meaning I had a colleague who was seeing someone whose son had Tourette's and her son had Tourette's, and she disclosed that to the client. And it helped the client to feel less isolated in her situation, and also helped the client to know that the therapist really understood what it was like day to day with the various challenges. But there are other situations where we wouldn't disclose something like that at all. So I think there's always this subjective litmus test. Will this benefit the client? And if not, then you definitely wouldn't be sharing that information. Of course, out in the world, I have a chapter in the book called Embarrassing Public Encounters, because we do encounter people out in the world. And it's a little bit like when you're a first grader and you see your teacher in Best Buy with her family and she's in cutoff shorts and you're like, wait, you have a life and you wear other clothes?
Right.
We can't help but, be human in the world. And sometimes our clients will see that.
You mentioned one anecdote about a child psychologist who's out in the world with his or her child who is having a meltdown and is like, "You're the worst parent ever," and is overseen by a client about how they didn't come back.
Yeah, well, those people actually came back. There was someone who started sobbing in Starbucks because her physician informed her that her pregnancy wasn't viable, and she and her husband had been trying to get pregnant, and one of her clients walked in and saw her sobbing in Starbucks and made eye contact with her, left, and never came back.
Wow.
And I think there's that, I think people want us to be human, but they don't necessarily want to see our humanity. And I think that it's important for people to know that our humanity is our greatest tool. Without it, we would be useless to help people. And at the same time, it's important that we have boundaries around it.
Do you think that everyone should be in therapy?
I don't, actually. I don't think therapy is for everyone, but I do think that it really helps people to see what's not working in a way that it's very hard to see from the vantage point of your own friends or your own family. It's really a rich experience to talk to another person, have them really see you for who you are, and still like you and accept you, and then to be able to see yourself that way and like yourself and accept yourself and learn how to relate better in the world.
You mentioned therapy isn't for everyone. I know a lot of people who are resistant to it, but we all still have issues. It's the human condition. What would you recommend for somebody who potentially doesn't want to go into therapy but does want to experience some of that type of self-reflection that you mentioned?
Right. That's kind of why I wrote the book. I felt like it would provide what therapy provides for people in a different way, but to help them kind of see, do you see yourself in these people that I'm writing about? Do you see any of the patterns that I'm writing about? A lot of people so far have said that they see themselves very much, even though they don't have anything on the surface in common with these patients. So, I think you can read books. I think you can, there are different ways to learn about yourself, but I think that the most powerful way to learn about yourself is in relation with another person, another therapist.
So in addition to writing this book and having your own practice, you write a column for The Atlantic called Dear Therapist.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about the challenges with writing that column, because it's such a different format than when you see someone one-to-one every week. And in your own therapy with your therapist, at one point he asked you, do you want counseling or do you want therapy?
Yeah.
And you sort of draw that distinction between advice and really doing the work. And it seems like this column is more counseling. So how do you approach it when all that you have to go on from someone is a letter?
Yeah, it's really different because in the therapy room, I can notice something and I won't necessarily bring it up that session if I think the person isn't ready for it. So I'll kind of tag that in my mind. And I know that I have another session where I can bring it up when I can plant the seeds in one session. Here, you just have this one opportunity. And the other thing is, when somebody tells me a story in therapy, I'm listening not just to the story, but to their flexibility with the story, because I know I'm hearing just one perspective. So I'm kind of listening for the music under the lyrics. Here's the content of the story, but I'm listening for what is the underlying struggle, what else might be going on, what might the other characters in the story be thinking, or what might be their perspective. In a letter, you have one perspective, and I know how limited that is. So in my column, I try to do a twist on an advice column. I don't just give, don't talk to your mother-in-law advice. I very much want to tell people, here's how I think about this as a therapist. Here's how another person that you're talking about in your letter might view the situation. Here's another way to think about your problem so that you can make a good decision about how you want to move forward.
I'm wondering about, you mentioned that you go to a consultation group. So you're not just seeing your own clients, you also have sort of an understanding of other people's clients as well. I'm wondering if you see any mental health trends in the last few years that you find to be noteworthy.
I would say anxiety and loneliness. I think people are pulled in so many different directions and they have so many expectations for what they want in terms of the career and the family and the marriage and their children, if they have them, their aging parents. I just think that there are a lot of stressors on people in terms of what they want to achieve and how difficult sometimes it is and the time that they have in which to do it. And I think the other thing is loneliness, because I think that no matter how many people somebody might be surrounded by, people don't have the opportunity to connect face to face as much anymore. They don't have organic community when they walk out their door, neighborhoods and organizations where they normally would congregate. And so I think a lot of people are, just carrying around phones and constantly having all this sort of input, but they're not really having meaningful connection with the people who matter in their lives.
I want to ask you a little bit about antidepressants and other medication. You mentioned in your book a figure that I found very shocking, which is that 26% of adults, or I'm not even sure if it's adults, people are on antidepressants. And they help so many people. And on the other hand, we see pharmaceutical companies marketing directly to consumers in a way that is sort of unprecedented. And, we see with the Sackler family right now,
Right.
Marketing opioids to doctors and to consumers themselves. Talk to me a little bit about your thoughts about antidepressants and about how the type of therapy you do can dovetail with medication.
Right. So I'm a big proponent of medication in the right circumstances. I think what happens is it gets misused. I work with psychiatrists all the time we share patients. The gold standard for major depressive disorder is a combination of medication and talk therapy. But that's for a major depressive episode. And then there are other people who really need antidepressants as maintenance all the time. But I think what happens is a lot of people want a quick fix. It's so much easier to take a pill than to do the hard work of looking inside yourself. And I think it's really important that people understand the limitations of what medication can and can't do. I think it's important, if they are curious, to go get a consultation, but also to really understand what talk therapy does, what medication does, and whether the problem that you're trying to solve would be better suited to a different approach.
And maybe I'll close out by asking you, what going to your own therapist, the very lovely Wendell, what did it teach you about being a therapist yourself?
He brought himself into the room, and I don't mean through self-disclosure. I mean, he brought his humanity, his personality into the room. He didn't, in graduate school, we're taught certain ways of being in the room with patients, and I think you kind of have to unlearn that a little bit and really come into your own and just be very real in the room with your patients. And he was just utterly himself in a way that made me feel really safe and comfortable with him.
The book is called Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, and it's out right now. You're currently on your book tour. Tell us a little bit about where people in New York can catch you.
Well, in Brooklyn tonight, I will be at Books Are Magic with Katie Couric, and we're going to have a really great discussion, so I hope people will join us. And then on Saturday afternoon, I will be at Words Bookstore in Maplewood, New Jersey, with Allison Benedict, and I look forward to that conversation as well.
Great. Laurie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure.